Welcome. I'm Mary Scifres from Mary Scifres Ministries and am thrilled to have you join us for this first of 3 webinars to talk about virtual questions, asking the right questions and exploring potential answers. Today's webinar is about the regathering question. Regathering for live worship. If, when, how? These questions are challenging, but today we hope we will find ways for you to address these questions with the right questions so that you and your team can discern together how best to reopen your sanctuaries and other places in your church building for live gatherings, when and in the ways that are best for you and the community you serve. So, the question that many of us have about regathering is really around how do we make this choice? And so I want to first remind you it is a choice. Sometimes in these conversations, especially if there's controversy in your church, it feels like you don't have a choice. Or in some churches, they felt all of these restrictions from governments and governors and mayors and worry that they don't have choice. And so I think it's important that we remind our church councils, our leadership teams, our staff, that we each have a choice. Choice is such an important first step in any decision making because it frees us to really discern what God is calling us to do. In theological terms, we call this free will. You have free will about if and when to reopen for live worship and whether to do it indoors or outdoors. And that freedom also allows us to rejoice in whatever decisions we make. And that's an important piece too, because it hasn't been a year of great joy since the pandemic hit 14 months ago in North America. And so the more we give people that awareness that we have a choice, the more they are free to actually rejoice in whatever decisions you make. Most importantly, as you are discerning and choosing, I think choice sparks us on that move so that this journey can be a journey toward transformation rather than a burden to be borne. I if I could see all of you, we've got so many people here, I can't see everybody on screen, but if I could see all of you, I'd have you give me a show of hands of how many of you feel that making this choice feels more like a burden to bear than an opportunity to move toward transformation. My guess is many of you feel that this is a burden to bear. And I want to invite you to think about the choice that you and your leadership team, thanks, Robin, that you guys are making is an opportunity to journey toward transformation because our churches have been changed in this pandemic. And many of those changes can be for the good if we ask the right questions. And so all 3 of these next 3 months of webinars are based on asking the right questions so that you can discern potential answers. And today, our first and most important question is really why? Why do you want to regather for worship? Why is it important for your people to come back in person to worship together? And so, what's your big why is the first and most important question to ask and answer within your leadership teams and then within the larger congregation so that you can make a God led decision, a spirit led decision. Ask yourself and your team, why are we needing and wanting to regather for worship? And as you ask that question, ask it again and again and again so that you might get into the deepest possible answers. BJ and I are going to role model that for you in just a minute so that you have an idea of what I'm asking about, a method to getting to your big why. And then when you get to that big why, you can decide, is it big enough? And if it is, I invite you to also ask the follow-up question, is corporate worship the best answer to your big why? So, Beej, if you'll join me in this little conversation, BJ pastors a church in Los Angeles County and has been there for just about a month. And I know that he's been having these conversations. So, Beej, why is it that your people are considering regathering for live worship? What's important to them in that conversation?
Yeah, it's implicit, it's unspoken. They just come at me. It's like, we got to get together, we got to get together, we got to get together. We had 91 people show up at the sunrise service in the parking lot, which just confirmed that they want to. And I said, so what's important is, and in I think part of it is just the pandemic, that they are so tired of feeling isolated that they want to get together with their Christian sisters and brothers, and worship seems to be the place that they do so. We're already having small gatherings. Um, Men's group kind of gets together and putters around the church and fixes things and works on, the yard. And women are getting together to fold the paper newsletters and things like that. And the choral group is gathering safely inside to record music, but they just can't wait to get back together. And that big why is, I don't know, it's a yearning of the heart, I guess.
Why is getting together for worship important to you and your people?
I think they understand implicitly that getting together for worship is different than getting together at a park, because they've talked about that. And it's like, well, we might show up, we might not show up. But there is something about corporate worship that I'm not sure they could articulate the why. I mean, and that's fascinating, because then it falls back on me. What is that why? But for me as a pastor, there is something about the body that is um, connected in worship, where the focus is clearly on God and not just about what we want, but about our need to express our gratitude, our praise, our needs before the Holy One, that is driving this ship right now.
So, friends, if I were BJ's coach instead of his wife, I would dig more deeply. I'd probably ask at least three more why questions so that he could clearly articulate why worship is the best answer to this yearning to get together. Because once he can articulate that, then it would diffuse much of the tension in the congregation and leadership when they do decide to get back together. It would also help him discern if indeed worship isn't the best reason. He already said, well, they've talked about maybe getting together for a fellowship event in a park. But if I would dig into why isn't the fellowship event in the park quite the right answer? Because for some churches, fellowship in the park might be the answer. And that might be just as important to them. If their big why is fellowship, then worship doesn't answer that big why, because they're going to be sad that they can't hug and they can't pass the peace and they can't, have coffee and donuts afterwards with their friends. But if indeed it is about the community coming together in the presence of God in a holy setting to worship together, that's a big why that a pastor and a leadership team can articulate clearly and share with the congregation when it is time to regather, why they are taking the risk to regather. Because the reality is, we will be taking a risk anytime we regather in the midst of this pandemic. And we have to weigh that risk against a big why that's big enough that we can say, yes, this is worth doing. I'm going to ask BJ to play another scenario. And this, of course, is a church that we don't know. It doesn't exist. Might sound familiar to you, but now this is Reverend John Doe. Reverend Doe, I hear that your people have been really debating in church council meetings, sometimes not so pleasantly, about whether to get back together. Why is it important for them to get back together in worship?
Well, we have two distinct groups. The first group is, how do I put this politely? It's a group that listens to cable news channels that have downplayed the severity of the virus and the pandemic, and are resistant to any in what they consider to be an infringement on their religious liberty. They believe it's kind of either it's a hoax or it's no more than the flu. And there's really no rational reason in their minds not to gather. And so they push back and they say, no one is going to tell us what we can do. And so we want to start immediately. They never actually wanted to stop. But we've got another group that has been listening to the CDC. They've been listening to the advice of the epidemiologists, and they're hesitant to come back because of some of that. But they're more hesitant because they're not convinced that the parishioners who they legitimately love are going to take it seriously, that they won't, the mask may cover the mouth, it won't cover the nose. It'll slip, or they'll roll their eyes, and they don't want to be in worship feeling judged by their neighbors. And so there's this push and pull, and there are two very distinct camps, and they're both looking to me as the pastor to take their side.
So let's follow the trajectory of the people who feel like their liberties are being infringed. Why is it important for them to feel religious freedom to gather and worship? What's the big why there? What's important about that?
Well, some of them are probably our most devout members. I mean, they don't miss a Sunday. And so when they can't worship corporately, they feel deprived. And because they don't agree with the rationale for not meeting, they push back all the stronger, where it isn't just the fact that they want to meet, they couch it in a more visceral issue, which is no one can tell me not to worship. Worship is a freedom, it's a foundational principle of our country, and no one's going to deny me what makes being an American so great. And they couch it in that kind of language. But I think when you push it one step back, it really is a visceral, don't tell me what to do.
All right. Let's before I pursue that, let me pursue the other group that really are hesitant. They're not feeling safe. They're not sure they can trust one another to follow the safety protocols. What's their big why for not wanting to get back together yet?
Well, they really believe foundationally that when Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, it means don't give them COVID, which could kill them or someone in their family. It's a pretty big why for them. And so they have come to the conclusion that they want to see either everybody vaccinated, or at least 80% of the adults. Obviously the kids that are under 12 can't be vaccinated yet, but they would like to see our congregation not just be safe with masks, but have that vaccine that gives us a level of assurance that the chance of spreading COVID is very, very small. And so they feel like if we have waited this long, we can certainly wait a couple more months until enough of our population at the church are vaccinated that they can feel good about the likelihood that they won't be a super spreader event.
So if I were Reverend Doe's church consultant, or even as his coach, I would probably say, I think you need me to come in for a consulting appointment with your church council, because this is a church that is severely divided in its two whys. And I would want to certainly help him dig more deeply. As a leader in that church, he and his moderators, or he and his lay leader and church council chairperson, or he and his whatever judicatory you have within your denomination, they need to be alongside the pastor, actually listening clearly to both of those divided sides and digging more deeply into what's the big why. And then, as pastor, the pastor is really the theologian in residence, can help unpack that theologically and spiritually, so that the leadership team can communicate more clearly with the congregation. These are the two reasons why we're divided, but we actually value this big why more than the other big why. And that's why we're deciding this instead of that. And without getting into it, I mean, you can probably tell what BJ's preference would be and where his theological bias is. I don't want to put that on any of you because you're in each in very different settings with different leadership teams. But thanks, BJ, for pointing out the extremity, wanting 80% vaccinated, wanting to go back tomorrow without masks. And many churches are divided along that extreme of a line. And getting the big why out there helps people quit talking about their personal preferences. Well, I want it this way because I want it now. I want it this way because I want to feel 100% safe. Neither of those scenarios are available to us right now. We're not going to get exactly what we want, and we can't be 100% safe. And so helping people dig into that why will also help them make a clearer, educated choice that can diffuse some of the tension about the choice you're making. So when you ask the big why, I invite you to, once you get there, then these are your three choices. You have a big why that worship answers. If you do, then it's time to explore the people and the resources, which is going to be the next segment of this webinar, and make your plan to regather. Or you realize, oh, our big why, it might be answered another way. Small groups might be the answer right now to our big why, or a gathering in the park, or a quarterly time down by the river. If it's another way that that big why could be answered, then you explore those other ways to address the needs that are arising. One church I'm working with recognized that the deeper need was they needed to see each other individually. And they immediately, once church council recognized that, put together a visitation plan so that people could visit one another out on their front porches, masked and safely distanced on a one-to-one basis. And it included some gift deliveries and some, communion deliveries, those kinds of things. And it really satisfied the hunger. If you have a big why that can be answered in a different creative way, explore one of those creative ways and then make a plan for that. Or if your big why isn't that big, or it's simply blurry, or it's not theologically who you are and who you believe your congregation is and is called to be, then you need to continue the conversation, pray and discern together. Um, uh, and I think we've got a couple minutes. I hope you all stay to the end. I've got some great free offers for you for those who stay to the end. Before I go on to the next topic, Beach, let's do one more quick scenario because I know some people are also dealing with this scenario. This time, Beach is Reverend Gene Smith. Rev Smith, what's going on at your church? Why is it they're wanting to get back together? I hear that they are insistent that it is time to regather this coming Sunday. What's going on?
We've got folks who are looking around their community and they're seeing churches that are gathering. They're seeing churches that are gathering in person. And they are deathly afraid that if we don't allow people to gather together and probably in person inside soon, that we'll lose members, that those church members will go to another church. And once they're at another church, we may never see them again. So it is it's kind of a fear based, and some of that is just based on a fear of losing friendships, and some of it is the reality that finances are harder since COVID. Giving is good in some ways and it's not in others, and they're just looking at the bottom line, and it's like, we can't afford to lose members.
Why is it important to them to not lose members?
Well, they're afraid of paying their bills. Um, they're afraid of having to possibly let staff go. Um, and it's just like anyone else. Am I making enough as an individual to support my family? Are we making enough as a church to support our church family? And they do see it as being good financial stewards, but the larger issue is that they're just afraid of losing folks and what that will mean emotionally, spiritually, financially, the whole package.
So if I were Reverend Smith's coach, I would spend some time digging into the fear. Why is fear important? Why is fear guiding these people? If you know your scriptures, you might know that Paul has something to say about that in one of his letters when he reminds us that fear is never of God. Fear is of the other one. And throughout scripture, even when you have the phrase fear of God, it means respect, reverence for God. It doesn't mean be afraid. Jesus says, be not afraid more often than he says pray. And that fear that is guiding so many of our churches is not a big why that should lead us back to worship, but it is a big why that needs to be unpacked and articulated, because fear is a very serious reality in our world today. It is true. There are churches that will never, ever make budget again. There are churches that will close. There are businesses that will close. There are businesses that have already closed. There are churches that have already closed. It's not that it's an illogical fear. It's that fear does not lead us where God would have us go. But fear needs to be tended, just like grief needs to be tended and anger needs to be tended. And so being able to get to that deeper level of what's the why behind the fear can also help you and your leadership team attend to the fears of your flock, diffuse some of that tension and anger that's rising up from the fear so that you can get to the best possible answer. In general, I would say that fear puts us in that third category of it's a why that's not the right why. It's big, but fear is so blurry, and fear is not something that's going to lead us in the right direction. It will probably have us lost in the wilderness for 40 years, as it did for the Israelites. But if you're in one of the first two, where you have a big why that worship answers, or even that you have a big why and you're exploring other ways to address that need, that brings us to the next thing you have to ask is, do we have the people and the resources we need? And figuring out the people you need, I want to remind you, involves not just the people you will need to regather for live worship, but also the people that you will need to continue your online ministry. I was recently reading an article from Yale Divinity School Alumni Magazine from 2 years ago. And a pastor serving the urban poor in New York City had talked about how important her online presence was for her manual laborers who couldn't possibly make it to church on Sunday mornings in downtown New York. And um, and I thought, she was way ahead of her time. Most of us did not have an online presence 2 years ago, but almost all of us do now. And we are serving a flock there that your people will want to continue serving in almost every case. And next month's webinar is on what that might look like to be doing some sort of hybrid of live in-person gatherings, and as well as continuing to nourish your online worshiping community. But for today, I really want to talk about who are those people you need so that you can be regathering for both your live worship and providing for your online worshiping community, and discerning, do you have the people that you need? And again, I would turn to BJ because I know his church is thinking very seriously about regathering based on a wonderful experience of outdoor worship on Easter Sunday, correct? Is that correct,
Correct.
BJ?
Yeah.
So uh, who are the people that you would need? Well, let's ask first, what are the values, the qualities you need in the people who are going to help you regather for worship?
Well, one of the things that I appreciate about basically our church council, our moderators, is that they insist that the staff be safe. So you need people who place safety very highly. In our case, everyone's vaccinated. And so when we gather, um, we can feel pretty good that everyone who is in a space, and we social distance, of course, but that everyone that's in that space is safe. So the chorus has gotten together and started singing because everyone's vaccinated. The music director is vaccinated. The organist is vaccinated. Everyone is vaccinated, and everyone masks when they're around situations that. So I would say, people who really want to be safe, and vaccination is a huge one. And again, respecting the social distancing and respecting the masking. Respect is it's key, because otherwise people become afraid. And yes, God is bigger than our fears, and that's we should not gather because people are afraid, or we shouldn't do this or that because of fear. But it's a reasonable thing, and it's an easy thing to alleviate if everyone is just on the same page and they act accordingly. And they need to understand the reason for the gathering. When the deacons kind of came up, deacons and I came up with a plan on how to get together and start doing in-person worship. And when I brought it back to the staff yesterday, there was all of this, well, what about, well, what about, well, what about? And I had to focus the conversation on what is the ministry of this church? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? How does this satisfy that need to do ministry? And so having a clear, you talk about it in terms of your why, but in clear understanding of what your purpose of ministry is, and that's essential. And then you have to have buy-in. I mean, people need to buy into that vision, that sense of where we all have our oars in the water when we're all rowing in the same direction. Because if you're not rowing in the same direction, you can work real hard and not get anywhere.
Thank you. I think coming up with those values that you and your team need to feel like you're ready to regather is a really important, it's kind of a follow-up to the big why and making certain that you have what you need. I appreciate, Beej, you pointing out for you, the big why is ministry. Is this ministry, and does my staff understand it as ministry? Do my volunteer leaders understand it as ministry? Um, when we talk about regathering, there are just there's labor to be done. So let's think about, who do you need to lead the worship part of that in-person gathering? We've already talked about, we want staff there who have buy-in, who feel safe and at peace. I see that somebody's asking, how do you find out if people are vaccinated? It's up to them to voluntarily tell you. But if someone is afraid, you might ask them, why are you afraid of regathering? What can we do to make you feel safe? I have one coaching client who has a staff member, his whole staff has been vaccinated, but one of his staff members asks, is the parent of two special needs children, and children can't get vaccinated right now. So she's just been really clear that she doesn't feel safe regathering. And so as they're putting their regathering plan together, because she's the director of children's ministries, they already have the technology in place, and they have a plan in place for her to continue leading virtually, even whenever they begin regathering in person, because she's such a key element to their worship experience. She does the children's message. She has a great relationship with the young families, but it just wouldn't be safe for her to be in person and possibly carry something back to her family. And so knowing that about which staff members you need, we're going to need musicians. You're going to need your preacher and your worship leaders, somebody to do your children's message. If you provide childcare, which I always encourage, you're going to need childcare provisions. CDC is still kind of hesitant about intergenerational gatherings because of the fact that children can't be vaccinated, and that we don't know the long-term health risks to our children who maybe are carriers but don't present with symptoms. So, you also have to decide, what are you doing about Christian education and Sunday school gatherings, and make certain that's part of the worship conversation, and that there are provisions made to make certain that our children feel included, even if we aren't regathering for Sunday school and Christian education. You also need to ask, who do you need to manage the technology? Every church, and I can't possibly go through everything here about the different options, but again, we'll talk a little bit about different options in next month's webinar, but your church is unique. And if you are in leadership and you do not know what the technological needs are, find out before you make a decision about regathering, because every church and every staff has a different list of technological needs that are going to be necessary to regather, and who those people are that can help you regather. You also are going to need the people that help you manage the state requirements. I was just mentioning to one of my churches yesterday that I called a church here in Southern California that has begun regathering. It's a very large church, and they have a large sanctuary. But even so, I think their number limits are 60, and it's several hundred member congregation. Um, so now that they're running out of space, right? So they need to add a second worship service. Well, that means they now need not just the ushers and greeters that they've trained, but a second set of ushers and greeters, or a set that are willing to stay for 2.5 hours instead of just one. But now they're going to need another set of cleaning people who's going to clean between each of the gatherings. So those kinds of things in California has very specific state requirements. Your state may have different requirements, but knowing what those are and who's managing those. The funny thing when I called this staff to ask, how do y'all do this? And the associate pastor was really in charge of training the regathering participants. And she said, well, I put together this. I have a great engineer in my church who helped me figure out the flow. So we have one entry, one flow in, one flow out. And then they helped me figure out the seating chart, and we got it all mapped and laminated. And then I had usher and greeter training, and they thought I was speaking Latin. So I had to go back to the engineer with all of the ushers' questions. We had to redraw the map, make it much clearer, much simpler, and then we were ready to reopen. So I learned a lot about what happens when two people are having a close-knit conversation, and it didn't include a larger group of people who had no idea what the engineer and I had been talking about. So, figuring out who those people are and what resources you need. Most of us don't have an engineer, but we can figure out a map. There are several church reservation systems out there now. I think it's churchreservation.com is the one that most of my clients are using. It might be churchreserve.com. I'll include that in my follow-up email, where you can send them a picture of your sanctuary and they'll figure out the map for you and the seating chart, and then they'll handle all the church reservations. Of course, you have to pay for it. You may not be able to afford that, but for larger churches, that's a really good option. So your volunteers don't get overwhelmed with the whole seating capacity challenge. You need to make sure that you have all of the resources on site you need, whatever personal protection equipment that you need according to your state or county requirements, and also just what feels safest and appropriate to you, and what you need in terms of cleaning supplies, cleaning staff, and the resources, the higher level resources that most of our churches are really hesitant to talk about because they are expensive. But thinking about disinfecting upgrades to our air circulation systems, as well as improved cleaning supplies, and probably additional ongoing staff. Not just a temporary cleaning service, but a professional cleaning service that you feel that you can trust and that really has taken their level of professionalism up to the newer standards. I'm recommending churches go ahead and look at this because the CDC is alerting us this won't be the last pandemic. And so our buildings, we hope, will still be open and of service and of ministry. And so whatever we can do now to improve our safety standards for the future will keep us healthier, not just in this pandemic, but the next flu season for that matter, and certainly any future disastrous health problems. Along with this, you'll see the last question I have on this screen is, how can we reallocate? I want to raise your awareness of how much work this is going to be or is already if you've begun any regathering, for your paid staff as well as your elected leadership teams. I've been a coach and a church consultant for 20 years. And it has been the most exhausting season I've ever seen amongst the clergy that I coach and the laity that I consult with. And we're 14 months in, and we're just barely beginning to reopen in most of the places that I work with. And the reopening is going to double or triple that workload. So when I say reallocate, I am talking about what tasks can you take off of the church's task list, or off of the staff's workload, or even off of the leadership team's task load, so that you have the time and energy and what young people call bandwidth, the mental and emotional energy to reopen safely and joyfully. Remember, we want this to be a choice that we can rejoice in and not be frightened about. And so in ministry, we far too often try to be all things to all people and keep doing everything the way we've always done it. I'm encouraging you, just as we had to let a lot of things go when the pandemic hit, let some other things go. Now you can say no to some things, maybe things that you've been doing, so that you can say yes to reopening when it's time to reopen. And but that's going to cause, you've got to reallocate. Each one of us is a human being with 24 hours in the day and only so much energy to get through that day. And each one of us is a human being who still is called by God to take a Sabbath day and to rest and renew in the evening. For God made day and night and called them both good. And I just, I ache for how many of you tell me you were awake at 4 this morning because you're still worried about the reopening plan. And so, whatever we can do to reallocate the workload so that we're not overly exhausted as we move toward a reopen plan. Which brings me to the third step for reopening. You figured out your purpose, and your purpose is big enough that you are ready to put a regathering plan together. And now you've figured out your people and your resources. You know you have the people and the resources you need. You've reallocated as necessary. What's the plan? Regathering is not going to look like our last live gathering looked. I don't know if you remember whenever this all started last March. Oh, I had the naive hope that we might get together for Easter. I was thinking probably not for Easter, but I bet for Pentecost. We had confirmation service planned at the church I was. We were sure we were going to be together by Pentecost. And of course, it's unlikely we're going to be together this Pentecost. Some are actually doing their first kind of soft reopening for an outdoor gathering this coming Pentecost, which is the end of May. But now we realize we need a plan. Regathering will look differently. In most cases, singing will not be a part of that. Or if it is, it will be performance style singing, where a soloist or a quartet or a vaccinated choir sing for you behind plexiglass or with masks or outdoors, depending on what your safety protocols turn out to be. But in many cases, it's going to be all instrumental music. Or things are going to be like the church I was mentioning, where their minister of children and youth, she will always be on screen and not in the sanctuary. That's going to be different than what they're used to. She's a high energy, loving person who's been a really important part of the live worship before the pandemic. That's going to be a big adjustment for that congregation, not to see her up front and to have her energy and all those children running up front to be with her. And even think about children's messages. They will look different. So what are the plan? What is the plan? And I know I noticed this. I saw who registered. About half the people who registered for this webinar are members of a reopening leadership team. And so you're thinking about the logistics of the building and the safety. But about half of you are worship leaders in your church. You're preachers, you're musicians, you're on the worship planning team. Those two groups need to be communicating with each other because the two plans need to be integrated. So make certain you're also cross communicating what the plan is and what the action steps are to get there. And then how much time do you need to prepare and how much time will we need each week? BJ was just talking with me about some controversy amongst his church staff. BJ, if you don't mind to talk to me about what are some of the new resources that your staff are going to be demanding as you started talking with them about the increased workload and how much time it's going to take for them to get that done?
Currently, we're live streaming, so everyone is there is music that's pre-recorded from the choir, from the chorus, and that's inserted into the service, into the live stream. So when you're actually in the sanctuary, you have these moments where it's like, well, an anthem would be here, you can't hear it. It's dreadful. But for the people that are watching it, it's great. And we were very intentional that we didn't want anybody who is watching our live stream to be missing any element of that service when we go forward and we start meeting outside. So we're going to have to pre-record everything. And then some of the musicians were like, well, then I'm going to be recording 2 numbers or 4 numbers instead of 2. And that's just more work for me. And, part of me just wanted to wring their necks. But part of me gets it that it is more work. It's going to be a lot more work on the staff. And, I reiterated that this is a ministry of the church. We are paid staff. And so it's incumbent upon us to do this, but it is what the congregation needs to move forward, and we can make it happen. And so we will make it happen.
Thank you. The reason I asked him to share that is because this needs to be part of your plan, and understanding of the extra work that your staff are going to be doing, and how much time, and you need to find out from them how much more time is needed to prepare, how much time each week, and how are we addressing those concerns and those needs amongst our staff, which brings me back to that earlier question: how can you reallocate if indeed the staff are going to be asked to spend more time? Most churches I'm talking with are looking at their virtual worship service being an additional worship service to whatever they're going to be doing in the live gathering. Well, that immediately doubles the work. And so either you've got to double their pay, which I'm guessing most churches can't afford to do, or reallocate so that they are still fairly employed and justly compensated, but that you are also, as BJ said, getting the ministry that is needed delivered to your church. Finally, when you can do all this, you're ready to regather. You have a big why that worship answers. You can celebrate and communicate that big why. You have the people and the resources, and now you're ready to support those people, reallocate their time and workload, and you have a plan in place. Now, when that happens, set the date and let people know. This is the final step, and it's such an important one, because I am noticing that more and more churches, regathering teams have been, many of you have been meeting since last March. So many of you have been meeting week after week or month after month for 14 months. You really know about all your conversations. And it's easy to assume that the 100 members of your church or the 600 members of your church know all of these communications that you've had internally. They don't. So now is the time to start communicating long before you gather that first time, and sharing bits and pieces. You can do that in your pre-recorded services, your live stream services. You can do it in written communication. You can do it in individual phone calls. It's not a bad idea for the people involved in the regathering plan to visit all of the committees and boards of your church that are meeting on Zoom, even all the small groups, so that communication happens in those more intimate settings where people can ask questions, and you can create a larger sense of buy-in, so that whatever decision you're making continues to be a decision that the whole body can embrace, no matter what you decide, whether you are deciding to regather immediately inside, to regather a month from now outside, or to put off regathering until next Advent. No matter which of those decisions, it will be controversial. And you want the body to feel as connected as possible. And that's where this communicating of the plan really, really will help you to remain connected as a community. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us and for giving us this hour of your time. If you need to reach me, you can find out more about me on my website at maryscifres.com. And always happy to take a phone call or an email from you. But mostly, I just want to say thank you. I know that time is so valuable right now, and that you would give an hour of your time to join us for this important conversation is very meaningful to me. I am honored by your presence and want to continue to be of greatest service possible. So don't hesitate to reach out to Carrie if you have a quick question I can answer via email. I'm always happy to do that. And I look forward to seeing many of you whenever we meet for creating a hybrid virtual worship, exploring how it is that you can continue your online ministry presence while also regathering with a live congregation outdoors or in the sanctuary. Even if you're not planning to start that until next fall or Christmas season, it's time to start the conversation now. So thank you again. And I look forward to many future gatherings. And I'll stay on here for about 10 minutes in case anyone wants to stay and have a personal conversation or a quick chat question. But otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Take good care, my friends. As we say at my live gatherings, kiss in a bush. Mwah. Love you all.